Okay, Marshall, then Rice, then Danny.
Well, I mean, I sort of agree with Gilad, but as regards this trade-off between refugees and Jerusalem, it's only out of my pay grade. I think all that we can do here is say what's a good proposal for Jerusalem, and if some other people want to make it part of a grand strategy, that's their business. On the Temple Mount, I'm not sure I would agree with the factual predicate of the speaker. The de facto situation now is that the Palestinians have broad managerial control and authority on the Haram, except when there's matters of kind of violent activity. So whatever that tilt is, the status quo would keep that tilt. I should point out that one of the reasons that this can be done within the Israeli system is that in normative Judaism, in traditional Orthodox Judaism, the Jews are not supposed to go onto the Temple Mount for reasons of holiness and purity. Therefore, if you can't go on it, you're not going to be managing it. You could have an argument over who abstractly owns it. The concern we should have is that this normative view is getting more porous. It's lessening. It's more and more religious Zionist rabbis are saying, we've solved, or we're ignoring these issues of purity, and you can go on the Temple Mount. And the extent to which this question is delayed, and the extent to which the Temple Mount becomes a place where Jews will flock to, either for nationalist or for religious reasons, it's going to make the present modus vivendi of de facto Muslim general control of the Mount very difficult to maintain.
Rice?
Yeah, I mean, I would disagree actually with both previous speakers. Why else am I here? But on the issue of trade-offs, I don't think that we should look at trade-offs in this kind of clean mathematical way. There is this and there is that, 1 + 1 = 2. It's a political issue. The deal that we're going to reach at the end of the day is going to be a very complicated one. It will have to be taken at totality, and ultimately, decisions on something like sovereignty over the Temple Mount, right of return, what have you, is a political decision taken by politicians based on political considerations and their reading and their sense of smell of the politics of the day. As negotiators, I think we have to understand our limitation in our approach as interest-based approach and leave some things to the kind of next level of the decision-making. On refugees in particular, there is the one similarity between refugees and the issue of Jerusalem is that they both contain the symbolic aspect. What I would love to see is, now you guys are done with this initiative, to have something on the refugees to deal with the practical aspects, the mechanism, the compensation, what have you.
Raise some money.
Because it's necessary to isolate then the symbolic issue. Finally, I have to speak to Geneva because it was raised so many times. And I must say, I might have to reread it, but I remember when we were negotiating Geneva, in our view, the old city could not be divided in practical terms. There cannot be walls. The issue of sovereignty over this quarter or that quarter becomes a symbolic issue. And I remember in Geneva, we reached it towards the end. We came up with the practicalities, and in the end, based on a political calculation of what we can afford and what the Israeli side can afford, at the end of the day, reach the issue of sovereignty. But ultimately, I think there is no solution for the old city except to have it physically intact.
Danny?
I have the privilege of disagreeing with my three predecessors. I think that there is a potential connection between Temple Mount right of return. Why? I do not believe that this conflict arrives at a state of rest with anything less than Arab, probably Palestinian sovereignty over Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount. That will require a major concession by the Israeli public, recognition of the Jewish attachment to Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount, ironclad guarantees of access, etc. The deal that Israelis will be forced to accept is, yes, indeed, you have a connection to the Temple Mount, and the rest of the world, including the Arab world, recognizes that, but for the sake of a higher good, namely a political agreement, you are going to waive implementation of that right. The mirror image of that is right of return. Indeed, the Palestinians were wronged by the creation of the refugee problem. Israel is responsible for the creation of a refugee problem in a manner that does not imply that Israel is a sin that need be atoned for. The Palestinian right of return indeed exists, but for the sake of a higher good, namely a political agreement and the two-state solution, the Palestinians will waive implementation of that right of return. Both of these deals are extremely difficult for the Israeli public and the Palestinian public. It is not a question of the political issue of the parties themselves, but marketing an agreement to both constituencies. Telling the Israeli public you are going to waive something very important to you, namely your claim of sovereignty over the Temple Mount. In return, you are getting, in return of that, a waiver of the Palestinian right of return. I believe that there is potential traction in that formula. It will be decided in the last hours of the last day of the real negotiations and not among us kibitzers.
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm coming at this from sort of a system engineering point of view rather than diplomatic. I'm amazed, I guess, all the effort that went into this initiative, which is a worthwhile effort in itself. However, as in any kind of a system, you look at underlying causes. You look at the fundamentals, the basis of what you hope might be some kind of an agreement. It would seem to me the underlying causes, the fundamental reasons why there has been no resolution have not been fully explored. Number one, of course, is Ambassador Kurtzer, we have discussed this before, is the refusal, and Abbas has said this on a number of occasions, the Arab world, to accept and acknowledge the existence of a Jewish state. That to me is fundamental. Number two is, of course, the continuous incitement of violence so that you have generations of Palestinians, and I think somebody said it might take 10 years for this kind of an initiative to bear fruit. Well, I think it would take longer than that because of the continuous incitement of violence on the part of the Palestinian Authority, so little kids growing up consider martyred suicide as their big heroes. And number three, somebody mentioned the sovereignty, the culture, I believe it is, of the Palestinians. And it seems to me that gets tied in with 1967 when Israel was reunited rather than any historical or biblical reference to any Palestinian Arab culture or heritage, sovereignty or otherwise, in Jerusalem in general. And history didn't begin in 67. Jerusalem was united until 1948, until Jordan captured and destroyed the old city, the Jewish city, and it was reunited in 1967. That didn't happen before that. Under the British mandate, under the Ottoman Empire, etc., Jerusalem was a united city. There was free access to all religions, as there has been under Israeli control today. Was not true 48 to 67. There was no free access. And we see until these get resolved, how in the heck can you come up with an initiative to further exacerbate the problem when you don't address the fundamental issues and get them resolved one way or another?
Perhaps I could make a comment there and answer that question.
What's his name?
I think if you try to look at the past and right every wrong, you will never reach a consensus between the parties and the peoples as to who's right, who's wrong, who gets what. So what we tried to do was intentionally to be aware of the injuries people felt, of the sense of injustice, of persecution, and what have you, but to take it as a given that people had certain belief systems, that they had certain attitudes that were either mythological or part of their narrative or historic or religious and what have you, the way they felt today, and to try to devise a mechanism respecting Jerusalem that could allow them to fulfill their needs in that city in a way that did not interfere, but even sort of reinforced the other. The older approach, if I may say, of determining who is right and who is wrong depends on the chances of a massive conversion of one community or the other, and for them to abandon things that they have taken in with their mother's milk. And that is why we took the approach we did.